Over the past year, we've been really appreciative to have the support of the Korea Foundation to allow us to turn our focus to these under-examined issues around South Korea, and are thrilled to hear from three great experts here today. Before I turn to introducing our experts, giving you a little bit of their bios and background, and then turning it over to them, I just want to make a few more logistical points. We're going to begin with our expert presentations, and we have some images and slides for you to follow along with on the screen. At the end, we will leave some time for audience Q&A after a little bit of mock Q&A. And I'll give you some details about how we're going to manage the Q&A session with you all when we get to that point. And I promise it's easy. You just click a button, raise your hand, and we'll call on you. So to introduce our speakers, first we have Terence Roehrig, who is Professor of National Security Affairs and the Director of the Asia Pacific Studies Group at the U.S. Naval War College. He's been a research fellow at the Kennedy Center at Harvard University in the International Security Program and the Project on Managing the Atom, and a past president of the Association of Korean Political Studies. He's published numerous books, articles, and book chapters on Korean and East Asian security issues, North Korea's nuclear weapons program, the US-South Korea alliance, human rights, and transnational justice. So Terence will be speaking first for us, giving us an overview of South Korea's maritime security challenges. And then we'll turn to Jean Lee, who is a Pulitzer-nominated veteran foreign correspondent and expert on North Korea. She led the Associated Press's news agency's coverage of the Korean Peninsula as bureau chief from 2008 to 2013. In 2011, she became the first American reporter granted extensive access on the ground in North Korea, and in January 2012 opened the AP's Pyongyang Bureau, the only Western text photo news bureau based in the northern capital. She has a bachelor's degree in East Asian Studies and English from Columbia University and a master's from Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. She's a member of the National Committee on North Korea and Council of Korean Americans. So we'll hear from Jean on North Korea and the inter-Korean relations in the maritime domain. And finally, we're very pleased to welcome remotely from Seoul, Professor Seokwoo Lee, who is Professor of International Law at Inha University Law School in Korea. He's also working there as the director for the Inha International Ocean Law Center. He has conducted research at a number of institutions, including University of Tokyo, Harvard, Georgetown, Oxford, and GW, and has taught both in China and the United States. He heads a number of law and maritime associations and committees, and is also the editor or on editorial boards of a number of journals. He holds a doctorate in international law from Oxford University, master's of law degrees from NYU and University of Minnesota, and a bachelor's degree from Korea University. He focuses on territorial and boundary disputes, law of title to territory, law of the sea, Asian state practice of domestic implementation of international law, and international human rights law. So we'll welcome him to give us some comments and thoughts on EEZs, China, and the fishing issue between China and the ROK. So with that, we're going to turn to our first speaker and turn it over to Terence. Welcome, Terence.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you, NBR and Allison and John, for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be part of this event. To start, I think when we think of South Korea and Korean security, we are immediately drawn to the nuclear issues and ballistic missiles and all of the things that are part of that, certainly in the last several years and earlier. But what is often lost is that South Korea is, as you had noted in your opening, that it is an important maritime nation as well. When again, you look at the DMZ as a hard border, South Korea is essentially an island. It relies extensively on ocean-going trade for its economy and also has a number of very important maritime disputes with its neighbors that we are going to be talking about today. And I think it's also important to remember that when you are looking at the broader security environment, South Korea still lives in a difficult neighborhood. as it has security challenges across a broad sphere, but the maritime security challenges are a particular class that are often not looked at as closely, and I think are very important. And this conference is very crucial as one to consider those issues. So today we're going to look at the different challenges from South Korea's perspective, particularly with the three chief players in the region, Japan, North Korea, and China. And so my task today is to give a bit of an overview on those. I will spend a little more time on Japan because my two colleagues will be giving excellent presentations on the Northern Limit Line, North Korea side, and on the China EEZ side. But let me say just a few remarks in regards to that before I spend a little more time on the Japan Dokdo Takeshima dispute. First, with China, I think it's important as a piece of the background to remember that South Korea has a complicated relationship with China. On the one hand, it has a very important economic relationship with China, economic opportunities that are part of trade and foreign direct investment with China. So there is a great deal of economic opportunity and such for South Korea in relation to China. But on the other hand, there is also, I think, wariness in certainly some quarters in South Korea about what impact China's future strategic direction will have on South Korea. To what degree in the future will their interests align? And if they don't, will China use its economic might to be able to punish/coerce South Korea to perhaps see the light, if you will, and shift its foreign policy direction more in the direction of China? Certainly, we saw that in regards to the THAAD deployment and how China punished the South Korean economy in that regard. So I think broadly speaking, it is important to remember that these maritime disputes that we will be talking about today are part of a broader, frankly, in my view, the biggest strategic challenge South Korea faces going forward is how it is going to balance its relationship with China based on economics and the United States based on security partnership. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be a very difficult challenge for South Korea in the years ahead. And the maritime piece to this is one part of that. In the Chinese area of maritime issues, they have overlapping EEZs that they have had multiple rounds of discussions to try to settle and haven't been able to settle yet fully. They have a disagreement in regards to what the criteria are for how to settle that dispute. They have been able to manage it to some degree based on agreements over fishing rights, but it remains some issues that are a challenge. Also, in relation to that, there has been illegal Chinese fishing in these zones and violence that has resulted between the South Korean Coast Guard and maritime enforcement officials and Chinese fishing vessels. People have died in these clashes over the years and remain a challenge in regards to managing this issue. On the North Korean side, there is essentially the Northern Limit Line. Now, this is a crucial demarcation line in the West Sea. There is another one on the East Sea that has been less controversial, but there are some issues related to that we can talk about as well in the Q&A if that's of interest. The Northern Limit Line has its origins coming out of the Korean War during the armistice dialogue. The line has, I would argue, some shaky foundations in international law, and so there are some significant issues here to talk about in that regard. I think one of the interesting historical pieces to this is no one has yet been able to find the actual document that specifies the Northern Limit Line. I have spent a week digging through archives and not found anything. I know many others have as well. My guess is this is probably some obscure US Navy order that either is buried somewhere or has been destroyed because no one thought it was that important. And so it has just not been able to be found yet to lay out sort of the historical parameters. Certainly no one at that point, I think, had any idea that this line was going to be as important and as permanent as it has become. But I think it's a crucial line and a crucial issue that as well has often been overlooked over the years. We certainly, when we are looking at the alliance and defense commitment and security, are often focused on certainly the nuclear and ballistic missile piece, but often have focused on the ground aspect of this. And yet, I think that in many respects, the more dangerous piece has been in the maritime zone. Maritime zones, I think, by their nature, can be more mushy, more difficult to make clear and solid boundaries. And so, over the years, in the West Sea in particular, we have had real naval clashes where ships have been sunk, sailors have been killed, i.e. the Chonan in 2010. And I think Gene will talk about that a little bit later. And so, again, I think important to remember this is a very dangerous zone and has been a very violent one over the years. And I think it is very good that in the last year or two of efforts to try to improve relations between North and South Korea, that there has been some emphasis on looking at this West Sea zone as perhaps trying to establish a peace zone, something to make sure that there is no repeat of some of the violent acts to try to address some of these issues. That said, I think it's important to remember these are really hard issues. And I think it's going to be a long time, not only for this, but for many of the other issues we'll talk about today, to reach some final solutions. Until the security situation improves significantly between North and South Korea, I think it's unlikely we will see the northern limit line change in any particular way. So again, I will leave the details to my two outstanding colleagues who will flesh out the details of the northern limit line in China a bit more in depth following me. So let me turn then to the disputes between South Korea and Japan. If I could just have my, could you back up one slide? Well, could you back up? Yeah, just I should have reminded as I did my opening remarks here, of course, as a US government employee, all of my comments are my own and do not reflect any of my bosses. So with that said, next slide. So in regards to Japan, certainly it is common knowledge to most of all of the different historical issues and frictions between Japan and South Korea that are part of difficult relations between those two countries. The last 2 years have been particularly challenging for a number of different reasons. One of the issues that is often not well known in regards to Japan-South Korea relations is the island dispute that Koreans call Dokdo, the Japanese call Takeshima. This has been an issue that has caused problems and is well known between Koreans and Japanese, but is less well known outside of those circles. Both countries claim sovereignty to the islands that you see on the slide there to the right. South Korea occupied those islands in 1954. And if you look closely at the island in the upper left, you will see that there is a dock facility, there is a lighthouse, there are barracks for about 50 or so Coast Guard and fisheries personnel who live there. And so South Korea also conducts periodic naval exercises to demonstrate that it can defend these islands. Of course, from a South Korean perspective, that means against Japan, but I think it is highly unlikely that Japan is going to mount any sort of operation to retake these islands, but that is another issue that we could talk about later. Of course, Japan argues that this occupation by South Korea is illegal. When you look back historically, they have a claim that establishes Japanese sovereignty to these islands, and South Korean occupation has been illegal. The Japanese have, on a couple of occasions, indicated they would like to take this issue before the International Court of Justice. I've not followed through on that, but of course, the South Korean position is there is no dispute to settle. These islands are ours, and therefore there is no reason for any sort of international arbitration. Sovereignty for South Korea is clear in this regard. The US position, as it has been for many of the other island disputes in Asia, is that the US takes no formal position on sovereignty. But it does ask and expect that South Korea and Japan come at some sort of peaceful resolution to this if they are going to do that. Certainly, the United States would like to see this issue settled, because one of the things that the US would love to see is greater trilateral cooperation between the United States, South Korea, and Japan. This is one of those irritants that adds to that. But the United States has not done a lot to try to intervene and push South Korea and Japan to settle this issue. I think, frankly, there is an understanding that the US is in a difficult spot here. And if it pushes too hard, it is going to endanger exacerbating the frictions between the two sides and could damage the alliance relationship on both sides. And so I think the United States has tried behind the scenes to encourage both sides to manage this issue in a very quiet, careful way, but it has been difficult. And certainly some have argued the US should do more to do this, but the US is in a tough spot. And I forgot to mention on the slide here as well, an indication of the US position is the US does not formally refer to the islands as Dokdo or Takeshima. Instead, it refers to them through the international name of Liancourt rocks, which refers to a French whaling vessel that almost crash landed on the islands. When you look at the islands, you can see they are likely not to make any dent in agricultural production worldwide. But the key issue is fishing rights and also the possibility of oil and gas reserves that might be within the area, and therefore 12 nautical mile and EEZ issues come into play. One last point on the Dokdo piece is this issue came to the surface in July when the Russians and the Chinese conducted a joint aerial exercise that came in the vicinity of these islands. One of the Russian the South Koreans scrambled jets when the planes entered their air defense identification zone. Important, that's different from territorial waters and EEZ. One of the Russian planes doubled back and crossed into the 12 nautical mile airspace of the islands. And the South Korean jets fired 300 plus warning shots at the Russian planes to drive them out. The South Koreans protested the Chinese and Russian actions. The Japanese protested the actions, but also protested the South Korean actions in Japanese territorial airspace. So while there is certainly concern about this as an issue for China and Russia in this airspace, there is also an overlay of the Dokdo Takeshima dispute for South Korea and Japan, which complicates this issue. China and Russia knew exactly what they were doing in this, as given that time period, relations again, were probably even worse than they are now, and saw very clearly, in my view, an opportunity to drive further a wedge between South Korea and Japan, which is going to complicate US alliance relations between those two. Next slide, one last slide. Let me just say a couple of quick seconds here about South Korea's Navy and the strides that it has made. Next slide, John. Okay, well, let me continue on here. As South Korea's economic interests and maritime interests have grown and its economic power has grown, South Korea has also continued to grow its naval capability. And while this is no longer on their Navy's website, a few years ago, I always thought this was a great slogan for their Navy: to the sea, to the world. And so as South Korean economic growth has occurred, as its economic power has been able to generate the kinds of tools that can support that and protect that, it has grown its Navy, not only a ocean-going blue water Navy, but also increasing the number of ships and the kinds of ships in its coastal defense. And so South Korea, as an amazing story of naval development, has built a first-class Navy. And what is often not recognized is these ships are all built in South Korean shipyards. They only have to get the weapon systems through collaboration with the United States. But I think that's an amazing testament to South Korea and its shipbuilding capabilities. And it has used that capability not only to help support South Korean defense interests, but also to contribute to international maritime security interests. In particular, it has, since 2009, contributed a destroyer to the CTF 151 maritime fleet that provides security off the Horn of Africa to be able to prevent piracy and control that. So South Korea taking care of its own needs, but also contributing to international maritime security. So let me stop there and turn it back over to Alison.
Great. Thanks very much, Terence. That was a really good overview. Set us up well for our subsequent presenters to dive into some of the things that you kind of flagged that they would touch on. So we're going to turn it over to Jean now to talk a little bit more about North Korea and the inter-Korean peace related to the maritime issues. Take it away, Jean.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just hope everybody is doing well and staying safe and healthy. It's been a busy week for me focusing on coronavirus and talking about what's happening with COVID-19 in South Korea and North Korea, but this is a welcome change of topic for me. I want to thank NBR for inviting me to this discussion and for drawing attention to these maritime issues, because often I think the attention is focused on the nuclear issue when it comes to North Korea and the challenge that that poses, and rightly so. But I do think that looking at the Northern Limit Line, and Terence was right that I will focus on that particular area of conflict in the landscape of the Western/Yellow Sea. I am a devoted student of Terence's research, so I'm very happy to be sharing the panel with him, and I really look forward to Dr. Lee's presentation as well in the South Korean perspective. And as you mentioned, Alison, in the introduction, I did want to talk a little bit of about my background, because it's not meant necessarily as a disclaimer, but I am not an academic. I am a journalist, and given my background, I tend to approach issues, these security issues, a little bit differently than my colleagues, and I try to draw on my experiences on the ground to help fill in some of the detail and the depth that is sometimes missing when you're looking at these issues from afar. And so I will try to focus on my experience covering and overseeing the coverage of some of the major maritime conflicts that we've seen during my tenure as AP's bureau chief, and as well some of the insight that I gleaned from my 3 years in North Korea. Of course, I've been traveling to North Korea for 10 years, but spent the part of 3 very crucial years, and that has certainly helped me understand the thinking and the motivation and the intention behind some of these provocations. So, and I have to say that I want to clarify that I've stepped back from daily journalism, and that has allowed me, it's been an invaluable opportunity for me to do the homework that is needed to really put these incidents into context. As journalists, we don't often have the time with the 24-hour news cycle to do that type of homework. And so while I was able to see all these events unfold in real time, now is my time to really step back with the benefit of hindsight and history, and to put them into context so we can understand them in a broader context. And that's precisely what I'd like to do today. And I'm going to be speaking somewhat extemporaneously. I think we have a few photos, and I'll let you know when we can bring those up. I don't know if you want to pull up any photos. I'll let you know. You've got the photos on tap, right? So in terms of the northern limit line, Terence, I think we need to point out that the actual clarification about where that line is, where the line was drawn, thank you for that map, and that it wasn't included in the armistice is crucial. I think you've also laid down the challenge. I would like to talk to you about what kind of research you've done in trying to find that document, because that is certainly something we do at the Wilson Center, and I would love to try to have my junior scholars look into those archives when they open up again to see if we can track that down, because the very fact that we can't pinpoint when that line was drawn is an ambiguity that North Korea takes advantage of. It's an opportunity that it presents for North Korea. It allows North Korea to wage attacks without technically violating the terms of the armistice agreement, although we could argue that it violates the spirit of the armistice agreement. And I should also point out that I don't think we expected the armistice agreement itself to be as permanent as it has been. And this is a good opportunity to remember that this year marks the 70th year of the outbreak of the Korean War. That anniversary takes place in June, and that it remains unresolved. And so the armistice does not understandably cover some of these gray areas, including the ambiguity around the northern limit line. And I would say another key area is cyberspace. It doesn't cover cyberspace. And so these are two particular areas of ambiguity, gray zones, that I think have been and will be a part of North Korea's strategic military planning, and part of its asymmetric warfare, because they can say, technically speaking, that it doesn't violate the armistice. And so I think certainly that leaves, when it comes to the northern limit line and the two Koreas working on coming to some understanding so they can reduce conflict in the West Sea, there's still potential there, and certainly the CMA of 2019 offers that. 2019, correct me, somebody correct me here, what was it? 2019, I'm losing track of time, does offer 2018, time is going by so quickly, does offer the opportunity to close up and eliminate that arena for provocation. But I don't think it will be easy. It won't be easy. North Korea sees strong benefit from the ambiguity that northern limit line presents. Terence mentioned the commercial interests, and he goes into some detail about that in his paper. The seafood industry is immensely lucrative, or I should say has been immensely lucrative for North Korea. Throughout my time there, I saw it promoted. Obviously, they see it as an area where they can put in minimal investment and gain quite a bit of return in that, I should say, in an era before these sanctions have prevented and restricted their ability to export seafood. There are also domestic political interests that we have to keep in mind. What benefit does the regime gain domestically from provocations in the West Sea? What messages is the top leadership trying to send to its people? The North Korean leadership needs opportunities to justify its military and nuclear buildup. And so in some sense, they need an arena where they can provoke without much consequence. That is a central core part of its strategy in keeping the people together, building a sense of loyalty among the people. And so they will look for opportunities to show their people that they remain girded against provocation, whether or not the provocation or the threat exists, in many cases a manufactured and perceived sense of outside aggression. And I think the third point is the external political interest, and this is the key point that I would like to talk about. We need to place each of these maritime incidents in historical and political context. What was happening with North Korea's engagement with South Korea, with the United States at the time of these provocations, at the time of these incidents. I think this is the piece of the puzzle that is often missing from when we look at these maritime incidents, but I think it's perhaps the most important piece of the puzzle when it comes to trying to understand their intention and motivation. And like I said earlier, I think that most of the world's attention is focused on the nuclear threat, the nuclear provocations, as mine has been as well. And that's understandable because it does pose a global risk to security and stability. However, I would say that it's very important to look at these maritime issues as well, because they are particularly aimed at South Korea and very narrowly focused on shaping and influencing North Korea's relationship and negotiations with South Korea. I think that these maritime skirmishes, when I look back at them, they are, in a sense, meant to prepare North Korea for negotiations with South Korea. And that may sound counterintuitive, but if you look back at the pattern of provocations and you look at the trajectory and the timeline of negotiations, there's an interesting pattern that emerges. It doesn't make sense to us, but it makes perfect sense to the North Koreans. And I'll try to get into a little bit more detail about this if we have some time. And so I do think that we need to look at some of these provocations as perhaps a preamble to diplomacy, as odd as that may sound. I think they also serve as a reminder. The North Koreans use these maritime provocations as a reminder to the South Koreans not to forget that this threat exists. And I say this because I was there in South Korea when several of these provocations occurred, and it was really with an environment where South Koreans have lived with the threat from North Korea for decades. They can't forget from time to time. And these provocations hit so close to home and do serve as a reminder. And this is precisely what North Korea wants. They want to remind the South Koreans, we have the capability to upend your personal lives and put you in a panic, and to remind the South Koreans that they need to come to the table and they need to deal with North Korea. And so that's why I say that they sometimes serve as a preamble to outreach to South Korea. Now, there are many, many examples, and I don't think that we'll have time to go through this, but I wanted to focus on the three major maritime incidents between the two Koreas that I oversaw the coverage of as AP Bureau Chief. And I think you mentioned them earlier, Terence. We had the naval skirmish in the Yellow Sea in November 2009. And that resulted in casualties on the North Korean side. I remember that very clearly. I was in Singapore covering the APEC summit, and I still remember that news alert coming through, and I was on the next plane back to Seoul. And what I want to do right now is for us to take a step back and think about what the political context was at that time. What was happening in the latter half of 2009? I'm going to mention that my time as AP's Bureau Chief began in September of 2008. The day that I began work was the day that we learned that Kim Jong-il, it sounds like I'm going off on a tangent, but it's going to make sense in a second. The day that I started my tenure as Bureau Chief was the day that we learned that Kim Jong-il had suffered a stroke a few weeks earlier and was in a coma. And so I see this as the official start for us in the outside world of the succession campaign to prepare North Korea for a transition of power, a transition of leadership. And I do think that all of these incidents had a role to play in the preparation for that change in leadership and how the regime was going to engage with the outside world and also prepare their people for this change in leadership. Now, 2008 and 2009, that period was a time of turning inward as North Korea was mapping out its next steps and mapping out this succession plan. I would say that if you look at what happened in 2009, you can put some of those, you can put some of the skirmishes into that kind of political context and understand what North Koreans' intentions were. We also had, do you want to show a picture of the Cheonan? Do you have that available? the sinking of the Cheonan warship? Okay. So in in 2010, in March 2010, and I will remember this incident as well because it was late on a Friday night in Seoul when we got the news alerts that a South Korean warship had been attacked. As we know, 46 South Korean sailors were killed. The image that I'm showing you now. So at the time, it certainly consumed quite a bit of our attention and coverage. I was there when the Ministry of National Defense showed us the wreckage of the ship, and I went back to visit it in 2018. And here it is. It's docked, or it's on display in Pyeongtaek, but does show you the extent of that damage. And just wanted to make it a bit more real for you when we talk about this incident. Now, what I want to do is, and the third one is the artillery strike later that year, the attack on Yeonpyeong Island that killed 4 South Koreans, including 2 civilians. But I think we could even step back further. We talked about the skirmish in June of 1999, and another skirmish in June of 2002. If we look at the political and international situation and environment, then we could probably tie these skirmishes to the North Korean strategy and how to raise the stakes in its future negotiations with South Korea, and I would say with the United States. Now, the broader context, I know I just have a few minutes, the broader context that I would like to pose is how have these incidents been part of Kim Jong-un's strategy for creating a sense of tension with South Korea and forcing South Korea to the negotiating table and to improve its hand in negotiations with South Korea. I think that the Northern Limit Line does present that opportunity, as contradictory as that may sound, because he does use these skirmishes as an opportunity to raise tensions in the region and to compel South Korea to act. Now, he uses these opportunities to justify, as I said, the escalation of and the investment in his military and in his nuclear program. And I'm sorry, just going to scroll down to my notes. And we can see even more broadly other opportunities that this type of tension has provided. I would say that the escalation of the nuclear program in 2017 is another example of how North Korea has used the ramping up and the building of its arsenal to try to create that sense of tension internationally and to use the opportunity that the Winter Olympics provided in 2018 to try to compel South Korea to reach out to North Korea. So I think that I'm just going to end it there because I know that we're running out of time, but I just wanted to provide a little bit of that political overview in how I think we should be looking at these maritime conflicts and how perhaps North Korean thinking will help us understand the motivation and the intention behind these acts of provocation.
Thanks very much, Jean. That was really interesting. I think we hear a lot of times about how North Korea uses missile tests and conventional provocations to get the United States and South Korea to negotiate. But it's really good analysis to hear that bringing in the maritime piece as well, kind of coming at it from a supplementary angle. So we're going to turn finally now to Seokwoo Lee to hear a little bit about some of the issues between the ROK and China on fisheries and some disputes between them. So Dr. Lee.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's again, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this program. To speak as touch upon the broad background of what happened in Korean Peninsula in ocean area, and also touch upon the relations with Japan and also NLL specifically. I was asked to speak on the EEZ, exclusive economic zone, and maritime delimitation with China, and also the fisheries issues. As you see that the map here, if you look at this map very carefully, geopolitical sense of Korea is very unlucky. It's surrounded by the major global ocean power like China, Japan, the Russia, and also in North Korea. And I can say that except a very few areas between Korea and Japan in terms of continental shelf, the Korea do not have any fixed boundary with the neighboring states, which means that the Korea is relying on the seaborne trade is highly, I think more than 99% of that trade, so that the Korea, the maintain the maritime order is a deep vital issues for the states. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, that since we don't have any fixed boundary with the neighboring states, in particular China, a lot of issues with came from the ocean. Next slide, please. So that, as you see that like other states, we have a sovereignty issues, in particular with Japan over the small island, and also maritime delimitation issues with China and Japan. And in relation with those issues, we have fishing activities and the law enforcement issues. And recently, we have some of the issues, in particular from the marine, the environment, because this preservation of marine environment to vital for the reserve the marine resources for Korea, and that these transboundary issues should be cooperated with the regional basis, so that these four issues, I believe that when you're talking about Korea and the ocean issues, I think they're very topical issues we have to discuss together. And the next slide. Next slide, please. When you discuss the maritime delimitation with China, I want to point out the two issues from the legal point of view, and three issues from the geopolitical issues. First, the legal issues. As you see that the states, when they draw the base points and baseline, they have to follow the rule, which is the normal baseline. But they both states, the China and Korea, to adopt the normal baseline, but plus they adopt the straight baseline, which is a little bit in conflict with the general understanding of the international law. Which state is more excessive? It was the issue. It is the issue, but I may say that the China has a more excessive than the length of the baseline they adopt. So that it was the issue in particular from the United States. But I'm going to back to the issues again when you deal with the international jurisprudence. But when you go to the third-party judicial settlement, I don't think that the straight baselines can be accepted as a practice counted by the court. So, and the other serious issues is that both states is a little bit in conflict in terms of the basis for their claims. The China is based on the natural prolongation, but Korea, it seems to me that they based on the equidistance line. So that the two basic points in terms of the baseline they adopt, and in terms of the claims, basis for the claims, natural prolongation and the equidistance line is in conflict. So that when they discuss in the table, it is highly difficult to reconcile in the basic the starting point. So I believe that the negotiation for both sides was stopped at 2A, and they resumed that from the 2015, and the two vice minister level talk and the the director general's level talk is on was done. And however, I personally think without having this basic the understanding, it is highly difficult for the two states to reconcile with the basic approach. So that baseline issues and also the basis for claims should be reconciled first before they discuss the more details. This is real issues, but political issues is more complicated, makes these cases more complicated when you thinking about the maritime delimitation between two states, Korea and China. Next slide. This POTUS is you can see that you can find this POTUS, these kinds of POTUS from the newspaper of the Korea, the not without difficulties. It's a very violent. The activists involved the Chinese fishing boats, and as Terry mentioned, that unfortunately there is some casualties involved for the Korean Coast Guard officers in 2013. So response from the Korean side is getting harsher, and also the practice of the Chinese fishermen is also getting harsher. So tensions is going higher and higher. So two states is try to resolve the issues the mutual way, so that two states agreed to resume the negotiation again at 2015. And from then, I believe that the statistics show that the a little bit the reduced number of the incidents reported, but so far there are tensions we can notice that from that area. If you see that the map, the right side, the white dots indicate the Chinese fishing vessels. And you see that how many Chinese fishing vessels inside of the Korean side of the Maritime area. So that is give a sense of the Korean people that the why Korean government or Coast Guard do not take this one is so seriously. So that fishing activities of Chinese fishermen is one of the factors for Korean governments dealing with these issues. The next slide. As the Jean mentioned that when we discuss the matter of the bilateral relations, China and South Korea, we cannot evade the factors of North Korea. Northern limit line, although the legal nature is very debated, even inside of South Korea, some people say that this is the security line, so it should be readjusted during the negotiation. But most of people believe that this is a territorial line, so it should be preserved. So that we see that the many skirmishes in this area. And 2007, the time the progressive government initiated the so-called the West Sea Special Peace and Cooperation Zone, which is not quite successfully implemented. But luckily, 2018, the Panmunjom Declaration adopted the Maritime Peace Zone. Whether this Maritime Peace Zone is performed well in reality is a different issue. But and personally, I personally believe that this kinds of initiative and implementation of a layer of diffuse tensions is very much needed. So because that is related to the Chinese fishing activities, because if we go to the estuary Han River, that area is a very interesting area because they based on the 1953 armistice agreements. The both sides, North Korea and South Korea, they cannot exercise any jurisdiction. So sometimes Chinese fishing boats go inside the Han River, but both sides cannot exercise the jurisdiction. So that the South Korea, the Coast Guard asked the United Nations Command to working together to crack down. So the North Korean issues is not only NLL, but also whole framework of the armistice agreement is relevant when you're dealing with the maritime delimitation with China. And next slide, please. A more serious one, if we go to South, there is another factors the both sides have to think about. For example, in Northeast Asia, although we don't have any fixed maritime delimitation, but there are three fisheries agreements among the three states. The three bilateral fishing agreements between Korea, Japan, Korea, China, and Japan and China. So in the southern parts of the Korea, there is area for three-state jurisdiction is overlapping. In the right side, there is a box. The legal terms of this box is current fishing pattern zone. It's highly complicated. So if the fishing vessels do not know what is jurisdiction is about, and if the law enforcement agencies do not clearly understand the what kinds of legal ground that they can exercise in that area, that will be the issue. So if the summary about what I want to say here is that there is two legal issues involved. The first, the baseline issues, and the second one is that the basis of the legal claims in terms of the maritime delimitation. But go beyond that legal argument, there are three factors: the political sense, the Chinese fishing activities, and another North Korean issues, and also the Japanese issues. So together with these whole things and in the framework of what is international jurisprudence say, I believe that I want to provide some concluding remarks of my presentation. Next slide, please. When international lawyers talk about the maritime delimitation, we rely on the international jurisprudence in terms of the maritime delimitation. The three states in Asia, in particular China and Korea, is a party of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. So we have to apply and interpret what the law say. And luckily, based on the couple of cases decided by the courts, for example, the Black Sea cases between Ukraine and Romania of the ICJ, or Bay of Bengal case from the ITLOS, and again the Nicaragua, Colombia from the ICJ, International Court of Justice, showed that so-called the three-stage methodology and three-stage approach, which means that the first they draw the line as a provisional line, as an equidistance line, and they count on the factors as a special circumstances, and then if whether the area is zone is proportionate or disproportionate, so that three-stage approach is this is quite a prevailing principles in terms of jurisprudence of the maritime delimitation. So we apply of this jurisprudence and counting on the two political legal issues and the three political issues together. I want to show that the last slide I'm thinking about this maritime delimitation issues between the China and Korea. Last slide, please. For example, this is my thinking is that I think it might be better for China and Korea a little bit narrow down the scope of the delimitation. For example, it is wise for two states to avoid the link with the North Korean parts, for example, Northern Limit Line, and also the some parts of the related with the North Korea, and also try to avoid the southern part, which Japan has also jurisdiction, so that the small area, narrow area, is more good for two states to draw the line. I personally believe that the current regime of the fisheries agreements, they work quite well in some sense. However, to have a more strong regime in terms of the legal regime of the maritime delimitation, it's much better to maintain that the maritime order in good way. So if two states go with this current jurisprudence in terms of maritime jurisprudence, I believe that they can reach a certain conclusion in the near future. So I stop here.
Great. Thank you so much, Seokwoo. I'm really pleased we were able to have you on the video chat. And we were sad when we weren't able to kind of bring you over for our in-person event. But I think that this is a really great alternative. We've heard from all of our speakers. I'm gonna turn it over to a little bit of a moderated Q&A, ask you guys one or two questions just to get the kind of dialogue started, and then we're going to give the folks, our participants that are viewing, a chance to ask a few questions before we wrap up. So my first question is a little broad, but thought it was relevant given it's a little bit of an anniversary year. 2020 marks the 10-year anniversary of the Cheonan sinking and the Yeonpyeong Island shelling, both of which were raised by multiple of our speakers. So that made 2010 a peak year for hostilities in the Yellow Sea. How do you all think these tragedies inform and shape the ROK's approach to dealing with the maritime threat from North Korea? I think we heard a really excellent points from Jean about how North Korea intends to use these provocations and what it hopes to get out of it, and that sometimes South Korea can become perhaps a little bit complacent about the threat, and North Korea reminds them that it's still there. So how do you see the kind of peak of tensions in 2010 affecting ROK thinking? And since I have a few of you here, if you guys if you have a comment that you want to make, go ahead and start talking so your box can kind of come to the foreground here.
Sure. If I can offer a couple of thoughts, I think one of the key issues in 2010 that is another reason why it is so important that this area is managed in a way that reduces tensions is that when the Chonan was sunk, there was a period where it was unclear what caused it. And by the time that was sorted out for a response by the South Korean government, it was more difficult. Sinking a ship is a serious issue. And most times there would be a military response to that. But given the circumstances, that was not done. Then you have in November, and when Yeonpyeong-do was shelled, this was very clear where this was coming from. And stories are that there was a great deal of interest on the South Korean part, particularly the military part, to retaliate, and to retaliate, perhaps even to escalate beyond what the North Koreans had done. And so I think from a security standpoint, you had South Korea saying to the North very clearly, you do this again, there will be consequences. Because I think the other part of this story is the United States worked very hard to restrain South Korea from responding militarily, as the US has done many times in its alliance history, because of a fear of igniting something worse than that particular incident. But I think there was a clear message given by the South Korean government that next time there would be a military response. And I think the North Koreans got that message. But I think it also speaks to the importance of why, and Jean touched upon this very well, of why this is a flashpoint that needs to be managed because of the history of what's happened, as well as what the potential is for something going forward.
If I could just add to that, if you look at the timeline again around the political circumstances around each of these provocations, I think one pattern I saw was that there's perhaps intent on the part of the North Koreans to put a strain and on the U.S. ROK alliance, and to force and push the South Koreans to test their commitment to the alliance, and test South Korea's own commitment to the armistice. The North Koreans are trying to push the envelope with each of these provocations and to test South Korea. And so it does that. Yeonpyeong-do these incidents really put South Korea in a situation where they have to make those decisions. And so I think that we haven't touched on this, but I do think that they are meant to test the alliance as well. And so that's a big concern that we should keep in mind.
That's a great point. Seokwoo, anything else to add?
No, the political point of view, I refrain myself to say something, but legal point of view, if you look at the northern limit line from the law of the sea perspective, it is highly disadvantaged for North, as you see that whole line is encompassed surrounded in North Korea. So that what I want to make a point out here is that Chonan incident is really tragedy. 46 young sailors were dead at the time. And how, the lessons we have to think about is that how we avoid this issue, this kinds of accidents again. And as I mentioned, that the methodology from the legal point of view, we have many the ways to implement that. One of them is a propose the joint development or joint the area to cooperate each other. In a sense that I think the current government approach to propose to North to set up the maritime peace the regime or area would be good. However, I don't know what kinds of actual things is ongoing over there, because the information to us is very limited. So that maybe to revitalize or you know to that idea more in practice is more important to see.
That's great. That was actually going to be kind of my next question. You segued really well into that, to kind of indicate that North and South Korea made some progress in agreeing to come up with this maritime peace zone when they agreed to the September 2018 CMA. They took some steps to reduce tensions. They covered up the coastal artillery barrel and ship guns along the DMZ. They ceased exercises and live fire drills in special zones. And you even, I heard of reporting that South Korea and North Korea agreed to kind of jointly or coordinatedly patrol for Chinese fishing vessel incursions. And so those were some positive steps, but we've seen a little bit of stalling and momentum since that time. Beyond these initial concrete steps, is there anything any of our other speakers see that could be achieved in practice to move towards a maritime peace zone, or is a real peace zone possible?
Well,
Can I say something?
Okay.
You go first. You go first. Yeah, from the bilateral level of between the North and South, the issues is not only go to the Korea, because these issues is international issues, or United Nations is the involved. So that whenever initiative taken by the South Korea against North to do something, it is linked with the Security Council's resolution. So that the issues is a little bit complicated when go beyond that this regional basis. So that I think we have to back to the issue about this maritime peace zone more specifically, and what kinds of issues we can deal with within the framework of the international law is allowed us.
I was just going to say one thing, which is that, as Dr. Lee mentioned earlier, there have been several agreements between North and South Korea, including the CMA of 2018, and we've already seen North Korea violate that agreement with the missile launches. And so that's a big challenge that we face as well, is that North Korea's understanding and adherence to these agreements, either bilateral or international, is hard to rely upon. And so, I hesitate to talk about what more we can do. I think we have to be mindful of the fact that North Korea has a very different understanding of how compelled it is to respect these agreements, because it has domestic reasons for why they feel that they need to violate them. And so that remains a big challenge, is how do we make sure that North Korea respects these agreements? They've already violated that CMA of 2018.
Just to add, I just think these issues are incredibly difficult. It is going to take time. There is years of history that has to be, and mistrust that has to be broken down slowly. And I think this is very tough. On a positive side, the fact, this may be one of those issues that, as long as nothing is happening, that is perhaps a positive at this point. And we may need more time for things to perhaps evolve to a next step, but I'm not optimistic this is going to change anytime soon. You have heard in the past discussion about joint fishing zones as a possibility. but there's a lot of difficulty with that. And I'm not sure North Korea is all that interested in a joint fishing zone either. But where we go forward, it's a tough problem.
So I'll ask one more, and then everybody listening, get your questions ready. So as our speakers identified earlier, the ROK has called for an equidistance solution to its maritime and EEZ boundary with China, but not with North Korea, where its position is the NLL is the inter-Korean boundary. Is this purely instrumental, or does Seoul see its maritime disputes with North Korea and China differently?
Now, again, I have to clarify again to avoid any misunderstanding is that the maritime delimitation issues between Korea and China is not the same with the NLL issues.
Right.
Because inside of Korea, as I mentioned, that we have a different understanding, very nature of this line, whether this is a security line or whether this is a territorial line. So that I don't think this northern limit line is the issues for the limit between two sides at this moment. And that these issues should be resolved at a more broad framework of the inter-Korea relations. So that I don't think it is good things. It is a general understanding for Korean academics to the limit of this northern limit line or readjustment. So that, however, as I mentioned, that still there are huge skirmishes around the NLL area, and the legal nature of the history from the history or the other issues. This legal nature of the NLL is quite debated inside of Korea too.
Mm-hmm.
So that the basic idea we have is that try to employ certain measures like this. The peaceful, the adjustments, the provisional arrangements will be the, I believe, the good way to overcome the certain difficulties we have at this moment.
To add one quick point that is a little off topic here, but something Seokwoo raised earlier that I think is really crucial, and that is the managing of the fisheries in the region, not only here, but the South China Sea and elsewhere. I think that is not appreciated as a central part of this, that if these resources are not managed in a way that keeps them sustainable and renewable, there are going to be some really difficult challenges that go beyond any of some of these other quote unquote hard security issues.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we're going to turn it over and open it up for some questions from our participants. If you look in your chat box or your panel to the right where it lists participants, you'll see next to your name there is a little hand. If you click that, that's raising your hand to show that you have a question. And don't worry if you click it accidentally and you don't really have a question, you can just click it again and it'll take it off. But my colleague John will be watching to see who raises their hand with a question, and will call on people as he sees those hands come up. So we'll kind of open the floor now. If you have a question, raise your hand, and John, if you want to turn your audio on so they can hear you when you're calling on them.
Okay, I'm on.
Great. Nobody wants to be the first.
Got a very shy audience here. Okay, here we go. We've got, if you can introduce yourself when you ask your question, just give your name and affiliation, please. Okay, Kesha.
Hi, everyone. My name is Keisha. I just recently graduated from Michigan State University Department of Science. Thank you for the three presenters for your excellent presentations on this South Korea maritime challenges. So I have a particular question for Dr. Lee. I wonder whether you can tell us a little bit more about, we know that there is a kind of tensional relationship between the U.S. and China trade war, and I wonder whether you could tell us how the that could have any influence on the conflicts between China and South Korea on the maritime conflicts. Thank you. That's my question.
Alison, I'm very sorry I missed the point. Was that the audio is very bad.
Sorry. Do I need to repeat it again?
I'll summarize for you, because Seokwoo, she asked about the U.S.-China trade dispute and broader kind of competition, how that affects potential China-South Korea interactions.
I don't think that is my specialty to respond. So maybe the Jean is more.
Was she meaning for Jean, right, Kasia?
Yeah.
I mean, like, any presenter can probably illuminate on that question. I don't particularly mean Dr. Lee, or if that's not his focus.
I'm not a trade expert, but I can throw in a few things. I mean, I think that is a good example of what I was referring to earlier about how South Korea can get caught between U.S.-China relations and trade, and South Korea's position within certain supply chains and how it is affected by some of those things. I think that's another example of how U.S.-China relations, if they continue to deteriorate, there are going to be some very difficult spots that South Korea is going to be in, not only in regards to economics, but also security, and that could be another piece to this.
Jean, anything to add?
No, I agree. I think, I've been over the past year speaking to South Koreans quite a bit about how to look at Indo-Pacific strategy, and where there's so much concern in South Korea and how they are going to navigate the strategic competition between US and China, and all of these issues are at stake. So yeah, I mean, I would say that certainly we see South Korea having a very difficult time navigating that relationship and the shifting nature of that relationship. And so, yeah, I'm just thinking about, my mind was wandering a bit, and I was thinking about how this affects, for example, South Korea's approach, the South Korean president's approach to coronavirus, because I was trying to explain to somebody, now I'm getting off topic, but that, there's so much domestic concern about domestic criticism in South Korea about how President Moon has kept the channels open with China, but he has to keep the supply chains and relationships intact. So, and we'll see this spill over into other areas as well.
I think just one other point popped into my head, that I think another interesting piece to this is you are seeing, in my view, South Korea understanding this difficulty, and the Moon government trying to reduce its dependency and broaden its economic relations, i.e. the trips that Moon has made to India to try to establish ties there in regards to economics, but also security. You've also seen increased effort, the Southern policy, as it's phrased, where Moon is reaching out to Southeast Asian countries that can be major economic players and provide ways to hedge with its relationship economically with China. And so I think you are seeing, as best as possible, South Korea try to work those different levers. But I think in the end, it's still going to be difficult. India is nowhere close to being able to match Chinese economic weight yet, and certainly not Southeast Asia. So this helps a little bit. So I think the strategic dilemma is still going to be around in the years ahead.
Right. So again, if you have a question, push the little hand button and John will call on you. And if you're having trouble figuring out where that is, you can also send us a private chat and we can help you work through that. Or you can type a question in, and I'm happy to read that out loud if you want to send me a written question. So do we have any others, John? Any other folks that you can ask questions about any one of our presenters' topics here today?
Let's see. Not seeing any hands yet, so.
Okay, well, while we
hopefully.
wait, guys, think of a few more questions. I'll ask our presenters just because we've you touched on, Terence, in your last comments about some of the initiatives that the Moon administration has been undertaking. And so that kind of got me curious thinking about whether, specifically in the maritime domain, some of the issues we've talked about with North Korea, separate issues with China, if you all would anticipate any change in strategy and policy and response if it was a conservative administration rather than a progressive administration. Would any of South Korea's maritime security policies shift? Would we see, I mean, I think the biggest area of difference we'd probably be looking at is in inter-Korean relations and how that would play out, but would welcome your thoughts on how a different administration in the future would be shifting any policies.
Let me start. I think the short answer is yes, and perhaps an emphatic one. I mean, I think there are, when you look at some of the debates within South Korea on a number of these issues, it is lively, as there is disagreement between conservatives and progressives about some of the policy directions, certainly on the inter-Korean area as well. Certainly, I think you would see perhaps a different approach to China than the current administration is taking. But nonetheless, conservative or progressive, they still will face the same economic dilemmas that any administration is going to face. Tough road ahead, I'm afraid. I think my colleagues are better versed in Korean politics than I am, so.
Jean, Seokwoo?
And you first.
I'm hesitant to predict because I think that there's so many things we're looking at right now. But I do think that what happens with the general elections coming up in April in South Korea will be a barometer of how the South Korean people feel about President Moon's policies. Of course, we're also watching what happens with the presidential campaign here in the United States, because certainly whether President Trump is reelected or whether a Democratic candidate is elected is something that will change and shape the reactions on the part of China, North Korea, and all the partners in the region. So it's very hard to, in a sense, I think it's a very complicated geopolitical dance in the region, and there's so many different factors that are up in the air right now. I tend to look at how North Korea looks at the political dynamics, and they will be watching all of this very closely as well and trying to shape and affect what happens with these presidential and general elections. So there's so many, it's very hard. We don't want to be in the business of predicting because it is still, I think there's so many factors that are so up in the air.
One of the things I want to talk is that, as I showed that the map in the maritime jurisdiction in Southeast Asia from the point of perspective of the Korea, since we don't have any fixed maritime boundary with the neighboring states, for me, it is very important for Korea to delimit with the neighboring states one by one. And from the point of my personal point of view, today we discussed many issues like a northern limit line or the maritime issues with Japan. I think the maritime delimitation issues with China will be more easiest way for Korea to take the first, because both sides, although there is some of the misunderstanding, disagreements on the various issues, But from my personal understanding is that in particular after South China Sea issues, the China also quite rely on what is international jurisprudence to say, and that also China wants to resolve the issues bilateral way with their neighboring state. So in a sense that the national interest for both sides, Korea and China, I think they can find a way to resolve the issues by peaceful way. So that I strongly encourage for the two states to take that issues first with a great manner. So that's if I choose the order of the priority for the state to deal with the maritime delimitation or maritime issues, I think the maritime delimitation with Korea to China should be the first.
Thank you. So I have a question that was sent in to me over chat that I'll read aloud for you guys. So there was some discussion about South Korea's growing naval power. The participant wanted to ask for speakers' opinions on possible collaboration or increased collaboration between the US and ROK on maritime security more globally. What do you see the prospects of that?
Well, I think that there are, again, the CTF, my Task Force 151 is an important marker for the US and South Korea to work together. You have seen the United States pressure South Korea to participate in a patrolling coalition in regards to Iran. That puts South Korea in a difficult spot because Iran is an important energy provider for South Korea. South Korea has reluctantly decided to participate in that. I think that points to how maritime cooperation does have some limits because both countries have different interests. And sometimes those interests don't align. And the Iran case, I think, is one where that clashed. But in the end, South Korea believed that it was important for alliance solidarity. Certainly, if you are following some of the difficulties over criticism of the free trade agreement first, then criticism about burden sharing, and those talks are still going on. And so a belief, I believe in Seoul, that they had to be doing something that would show that they were demonstrating the benefit the alliance provides to the United States, with South Korea being able to do this. I think the United States would like to see South Korea participate to a greater degree in ballistic missile defense. South Korea has a very good ballistic missile defense capability. But again, the China factor comes into play, as it has been concerned that too closely of a collaboration with the United States is going to upset China for some of the same reasons you saw China display in regards to THAAD. Japan is all in with the United States in regards to ballistic missile collaboration. South Korea has gone to fairly significant effort to emphasize that its ballistic missile defense capabilities are independent of that regional architecture. There still is some collaboration, but I think that is going to be limited to some degree. I think the United States would love the South Koreans to join in patrols in the South China Sea to demonstrate what the United States has often said, that we will sail, fly, and operate anywhere international law allows in the South China Sea. Again, there is a China factor that makes that difficult for South Korea to do. So I suppose the short answer is I don't see any specific areas of cooperation directly that you will see the two navies do, other than they will certainly continue to exercise, demonstrate alliance solidarity, those sorts of things. But to my knowledge, there's nothing on the horizon that is a formal operation other than the Iran piece. But this is always something where there is room for collaboration in the future of the two navies working together. I think they understand that they have important interests to defend freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation, because again, South Korea depends heavily on those global international norms of free shipping.
So we have one hand up here. Do-Young Jung, can you ask your question, please?
Yeah, great. My name is Do-Young, and I'm currently studying politics at the University of Hong Kong. And first of all, thank you very much for today's session. And I sincerely hope everyone here is staying in good health amid this global crisis. So back to my question. This question is to Professor Roehrig, but other speakers are also welcome to comment. So today, China's rise is something that we can't neglect anymore. I mean, the government spends a lot of money on its military while the economy and technology improved exponentially during the past few decades. So based on this notion, to what extent is the US-China disputes in the South China Sea an important catalyst in the prospect of South Korea's maritime security? I mean, hypothetically, if China becomes more dominant and rise as a sole power in this region, how will this affect South Korea and its naval strategy? Yeah, that is my question.
Very good question. And thank you to you for being up so late in Singapore and joining us. That's a really good question. And certainly South Korea is watching all of those things very closely. I think a really interesting indicator of how South Korea has sought to handle this was its response to the 2016 China-Philippines arbitration case. South Korea was being very careful and relatively quiet. The Obama administration pushed President Park to be more vocal about some of those issues. And she spoke, I believe, once or twice about the importance of being a free and open maritime sphere to make sure that commerce still flowed, et cetera, but of course was very careful in how those things were phrased. Then the dispute was settled, and South Korea issued, I thought, what was a very savvy statement in regards to its response to the decision. On the one hand, it applauded the decision, which overwhelmingly was against China, and talked about the importance of free and open navigation, about some of the islands and sovereignty, et cetera, and went much farther than I think many people thought. But Seokwoo might have some other thoughts on this. And so South Korea came out with essentially a two-part statement that acknowledged the importance of that ruling for maintaining maritime commerce, maintaining the rules of navigation, et cetera, essentially supporting the United States position on this. But the second part was a very careful response for the Chinese side of this, acknowledging that this was a difficult issue. The ruling probably didn't solve this, and it was going to require, and did not call out China in a specific way to follow the ruling, but said that it was something that was going to probably not settle the issue and require continued dialogue between the participants to settle this. And so I think, again, as an example, the South China Sea has implications in other areas throughout the entire region and are going to be very difficult, very challenging issues to settle going forward and to manage. I mean, again, I think the notion of solving these, settling these is often not the way to think about it. It's about managing these issues.
If I add one small things about the Korean statement in terms of the South China arbitration, the Terry mentioned there's a shabby statement. I think it's a well-written statement because we have serious issues to count on. The most important, this is my personal view, is that I personally don't like the arbitration is extend the jurisdiction in terms of a state who do not want to go to court. Although, we don't have enough time to discuss all the details, but on one hand, for Korea, as you understand that the maritime security or the order of the maritime domain is a very, very vital, in a sense that freedom of navigation is very important. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the judicial bodies can extend their jurisdiction to the state who do not want to refer the case. And, although there is still after 2016, a lot of the discussions made to international lawyers all over the world. However, this is my personal understanding is that in some parts, I don't quite understand how the arbitral bodies, tribunal to take that case with the jurisdiction level. So that's why I believe that the Korean government or the academics has a little bit hesitate to the full agreement about all the issues involved.
I have another question that's come in to us over message. And this one is for Dr. Lee, and then I'll let our other speakers, of course, weigh in. So the question is that you said that South Korea ought to put an early priority on maritime delimitation with China. Are there accompanying diplomatic, security, economic, or other factors that are necessary for the ROK to move forward? Is there a useful role that the U.S. might play in this? And what do you see as the likely responses from Beijing? Does China have expectations that must be met before delimitation can occur?
The basic reasons why I mentioned that among the various maritime issues the Korea has, why I choose the Korea-China maritime delimitation is the easiest one or the first one the Korea government to take it seriously, because that issues only the issues the sovereignty do not involve. But for example, as Terry showed that what is the relations between Korea and Japan, we do have sovereignty issues between two sides. And also Northern Limit Line and the North Korean issues is a highly political issues go beyond if we compare with the two other states. So that let's say in terms of the maritime delimitation between Korea and China, the more economic issues involved rather than political and security issues we point out today's discussion. So, but for the Korean point of view, for the state who has relied on the seaborne trade heavily, it is very much important to fix the boundary one by one. In a sense that I suggest that the maritime delimitation between China and Korea will be an easiest one. And from my point of view, based on the current jurisprudence of international law on maritime delimitation, I don't think it is not much difficult than we expect if both states, the political will enough to tackle that issues with a serious manner. So that's why I suggest that.
Anything for the speakers?
No, I defer to the international lawyer on that.
Thank you. All right, so I'll give our speakers any concluding remarks, thoughts you want to make before we wrap it up. Okay. Thanks everybody for joining us. Normally at an event, we would invite you to engage with the speakers, come up and talk to them afterwards to ask any follow-up questions or have other side conversations you might want to have. In this case, I would just say that if you have some additional questions for our speakers, feel free to email us at psa@nbr.org, and we'd be glad to put you in touch with the experts that we're speaking here today. That way you can email your questions with them directly. So let's, you don't have to turn your audio on. I'll just thank our speakers for everybody here for some wonderful remarks. And thanks for everybody for bearing with us as we kind of experimented with this new forum and this new setting.
Thank you.
Thank Thank you.
It's challenging, I have to say. It's hard. It's much harder than doing it in person, I think.
You don't have that connection, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, you guys did wonderfully. Thanks to everybody who joined us. And we'll try another event like this sometime in the next few weeks. So thanks, everybody.
Everyone, stay safe.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
You too.
Okay.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
We're signing off.
Bye.